My name is Natalie Carter. I'm 32 years old. And the strange thing about the moment your life begins to split open is that it almost never arrives sounding like a tragedy. There's no music, no thunder, no movie scene silence where everyone in the room somehow senses that something precious has just died. Most of the time, disaster is quieter than that. It wears a pleasant expression. It stands under warm restaurant lights. It lifts a champagne glass. And then, in a calm voice, it says one sentence your heart understands before your mind is willing to. 3 weeks ago, I still thought I was going to marry a man named Evan Whitmore. Or maybe that isn't the truth. Maybe the truth is that I thought I was going to marry the version of him I had been protecting in my head. The careful version. The polished version. The one who said all the right things when it was just the two of us, and never let me look too closely at what he became whenever his family was in the room. Evan and I had been together for 3 years. 3 years is a dangerous amount of time. It is long enough to build rituals, long enough to confuse familiarity with safety, long enough to start speaking in future tense like it's a fact. We had done that. We had talked about where we wanted to live. We had talked about money. We had talked about kids in the vague, smiling way couples do when they think they still have time. He had met my mother. I had attended holidays with his family in houses so large and tastefully decorated, they almost felt like museums pretending to be homes. And somewhere in those 3 years, I made the mistake people make when they love someone. I believed that understanding once spoken meant understanding permanently held. I need to explain something before I tell you what happened that night. My family name matters to me, not because I think I own anyone, not because I believe blood makes people more important, not because I had some fantasy about children existing to carry a banner. It matters because my father died when I was 19. A heart attack. Quick, cruel. The kind of phone call that cuts your life cleanly into before and after. And 6 years later, my older sister died in a car accident driving home after a late shift. So when people say, it's only a name, I know what they mean. What they mean is that names are abstract to people who have never had to cling to one like it was the last physical object left floating after a shipwreck. Now it's just me and my mother. Just the two of us. And that name, our name, became something heavier after they died. Not sacred exactly, but tender, loaded, like an heirloom nobody can afford to drop. I had explained that to Evan early in our relationship, not in a dramatic speech, not in some tearful midnight confession, just honestly, quietly. The way you tell someone what matters if you think they're building a future with you. He had nodded, reached for my hand, said he understood. That was the thing that haunted me afterward. Not that he disagreed, not even that he wanted something different, but that he had looked me in the face months earlier with that gentle, patient expression people mistake for sincerity and made me believe we were standing on the same ground. His family, on the other hand, had never really mastered subtlety. They had money, old money, or at least the sort of money that had ripened long enough to become personality. His great-grandfather had founded some industrial manufacturing company. It had been sold decades ago for more money than I can comfortably picture, and since then, the family had lived in a polished orbit of investment income, properties, charity galas, and private opinions delivered as if they were universal truths. No one ever said directly that I was beneath them. They didn't have to. People like that rarely insult you in a way you can quote later. They do it in softer ways, in pauses, in glances, in the curious tone they use when asking where your mother lives now, in the faint surprise when they learn your father worked with his hands. My dad was a mechanic, the best one in our county. People drove from other towns to have him work on their cars because he was the kind of man who fixed things honestly and spoke plainly and never made anyone feel stupid for not knowing how an engine worked. My sister used to say he could listen to a car for 10 seconds and hear what was broken the way a doctor hears a bad cough. He paid our bills, put us through school, loved my mother in a way that made the whole house feel steadier. There was nothing small about the life he built. But to people like Evan's mother, value only counts when it has the right wrapping. The engagement party was held in the back room of an expensive Italian restaurant downtown. Nearly 90 people, family, friends, co-workers, soft lighting, open bar, white flowers everywhere. The kind of event designed to look effortless while costing a ridiculous amount of money. His parents made sure everyone knew they had paid for it. Not rudely, not outright. Just often enough. I remember standing beside Evan in a dark green dress, smiling so much my face hurt, thinking I should have been happier than I was. That's the other thing I've learned. Sometimes your body notices danger before your pride is willing to call it by name. His father gave a toast first. Predictable, harmless, full of phrases like bright future and wonderful union and families coming together. Then Evan took the microphone. I can still see the exact way he looked. Relaxed, confident, almost glowing. Not nervous. That part matters. People do not look that calm when they are making impulsive mistakes. They look that calm when they have rehearsed. He started by talking about our future. How excited he was, how much he loved me, how ready he was for the next chapter of our lives. The room softened around us. People smiled, a few people laughed, someone clinked a glass. Then he said, "And I want to share something important to me before we officially begin this next stage." I remember feeling the smallest flicker of confusion, because we hadn't talked about him making any announcement. He smiled at me when he said it, like I was supposed to feel included. "After we get married," he said, "I'll be keeping my family name, of course, and when we have children, they'll carry only my last name." There are moments when silence doesn't feel empty. It feels violent. That room went so still I could hear the low hum of the air conditioning near the ceiling. I did not look at him first. I looked at my mother. That was my mistake, because once I saw her face, everything inside me sharpened all at once. She wasn't crying. It would have been easier if she had been. No, her expression was smaller than that. Like something had collapsed inward behind her eyes, like she had been made to sit through a private funeral in public and wasn't sure whether she was allowed to move. Then I turned back to Evan. He was still smiling, still holding the microphone, still standing there in front of 90 people, as if he had just announced a honeymoon destination, instead of staking a claim over children we did not even have yet. And worse than the words, the far worse thing, was the assumption beneath them, that he got to decide, that he got to present it publicly, that I would absorb the humiliation politely because making a scene would be less elegant than being erased. I took a breath. Then another. My glass was in my hand, and I realized I had gripped it so tightly my fingers hurt. "That's your choice," I said. My voice came out calm enough that several people visibly relaxed, probably thinking the danger had passed. Evan blinked, then laughed lightly into the microphone. "I knew you'd understand," he said. Understand. I don't know why that word hit harder than the announcement itself. Maybe because it turned my silence into agreement before I had even been given space to object. Maybe because it told me, right there in front of everyone, that he thought my history could be managed as long as he framed it nicely enough. I set my drink down. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't snatch the microphone from his hand and give the room the dramatic breakdown they probably would have remembered for years. Instead, I reached into my purse, took out my phone, and walked into the hallway. There was a brunch event scheduled for the next day, a follow-up gathering his parents had insisted on, complete with another venue booking and a private room, and all the little expensive touches people add when they think money can force joy to become real. I called the rental company, canceled it. The deposit was still refundable. The woman on the phone asked if everything was all right. I looked at the darkened window across from me and saw my own reflection staring back. Too still, too pale, too old for 32. "No," I said, "but it will be." Then I ended the call and went back inside. The room had not recovered. People were pretending to talk, pretending to sip drinks, pretending not to watch me. Evan had handed off the microphone by then. His mother was speaking to one of the servers in a tight, controlled voice. His aunt was smiling too widely at a nearby table. His grandmother sat upright with that brittle expression wealthy women wear when they believe they're being publicly tested. I walked directly past all of them, straight to my mother. Then I leaned down and said, "We're leaving." She looked up at me once and nodded immediately. No questions. That almost broke me more than anything else, because it meant she knew. It meant she understood at once that whatever had just happened was not repairable with a private conversation and a glass of wine and some embarrassed apologies in the parking lot. Evan reached me before I could turn away. He touched my arm lightly, smiling still, but now there was strain underneath it. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Where are you going?" I looked at his hand on my arm first, then at his face. And in that moment, for the first time in 3 years, he looked exactly like a stranger wearing someone I loved. "This engagement is over," I said. He laughed once. A short, stunned sound. "What?" I took off the ring. I had worn it for 4 months. Long enough for the pale mark beneath it to feel more intimate than the diamond itself. I set it on the nearest table between us. Not thrown, not dramatic, placed. "You made a unilateral decision about our future children," I said, and announced it in front of 90 people without discussing it with me first. His face changed. The smile dropped, not into remorse, into irritation. "Natalie, don't do this here." That sentence told me everything I still hadn't wanted to know. Not I'm sorry, not I didn't realize, not can we talk. Don't do this here. As if the location of my refusal was the offense, not the public cruelty that caused it. You knew what my family name means to me, I said. You knew what it carries. You knew about my father. You knew about my sister. And you decided that none of that mattered enough to discuss before you stood up and declared our future for me. His mother was close enough now to hear every word. So were half the guests. Good. Because if he had wanted privacy, he should have chosen it before he picked up a microphone. Evan's jaw tightened. You're overreacting. I almost smiled. Not because it was funny, because it was so pathetically predictable. No accountability, only strategy. I picked up my purse. No, I said. I'm finally reacting the correct amount. Then I turned, took my mother's hand, and walked out of that room. Behind us, I heard the low crash of panic beginning to spread. His mother's voice rose first, controlled but urgent, telling people there had just been a misunderstanding, that emotions were high, that everything was fine. But it wasn't. And for once, I didn't stay to help someone else maintain the illusion. The call came that night at 11:47 p.m. I remember the exact time because I was sitting on my couch in the dark, shoes kicked off near the door, makeup half washed away, my mother finally asleep in the guest room after insisting she didn't want to be alone. My phone lit up on the coffee table. Diane Whitmore, his mother. For a full second, I just stared at the screen. Then I answered. Her voice came through sharp and polished. How dare you humiliate my son in front of everyone? No hello, no pause, no shame. I leaned back against the couch and closed my eyes. And suddenly, more than the party, more than the speech, more than Evan's smile, it was that sentence that made the whole shape of what I had almost married become clear. Because women like Diane Whitmore do not call to ask what happened. They call to restore order. And I knew, before she said another word, that the night was not over. The thing about anger like Diane Whitmore's is that it doesn't burn fast. It settles in, cold, controlled, strategic. You embarrassed our family, she continued, her voice measured now, almost conversational. Do you have any idea how many people were there? The kind of connections you just... I didn't embarrass anyone, I said, cutting in before she could build momentum. Your son made a decision about our future children without ever discussing it with me. He announced it publicly, I responded. There was a pause, not silence. Calculation. You're being dramatic, she said finally. It's a name. I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling. It's always just something when it doesn't belong to them. It's not just a name to me, I said, and he knew that. Another pause. Then she laughed. Soft, sharp. You should be grateful, Natalie. There it was. The word landed heavier than anything else she had said. Grateful. For what? I asked, though I already knew the answer. For the opportunity, she said. Do you know how many women would give anything to marry into our family? To have access to what we've built? Access. Built. Words that sounded impressive until you looked too closely at them. My father built something too, I said quietly. I hadn't meant to bring him into it. But once his name was in my throat, it didn't stay there. He worked 60-hour weeks in a garage that didn't even have proper heating in the winter. He put 2 daughters through school. He paid off a house. He never asked anyone for anything. Diane didn't hesitate. That's not the same thing, she said. Of course it wasn't. Not to her. Your family's legacy, she continued, doesn't compare to ours. That was the moment everything inside me went still. Because now it wasn't about misunderstanding. It wasn't about poor communication or bad timing or a speech that came out wrong. It was exactly what it sounded like. A ranking system. And I knew where she had already decided I belonged. I ended the call without responding. Just pulled the phone away from my ear and let the silence settle around me again. The next morning, the messages started. Evan first. Of course. Evan, can we talk? I didn't respond. Evan, I didn't mean it the way it sounded. Then, 10 minutes later, Evan, you blindsided me last night. That one almost made me laugh. Blindsided. The words sat there on the screen like a mirror turned the wrong direction. I set the phone face down. It lit up again almost immediately. Calls, texts, notifications stacking on top of each other like pressure building behind a door I had no intention of opening. By noon, the tone shifted, from soft to irritated. Evan, you're overreacting. Evan, it's not that big of a deal. Evan, we can compromise. Compromise. I stared at that word longer than the others, because it sounded reasonable, until you realized what it actually meant in this situation. He had already made the decision, announced it, framed it as final. And now, after I walked away, suddenly there was space for discussion? That wasn't compromise. That was damage control. I didn't respond. By evening, the messages turned sharper, more pointed, more revealing. Evan, you made me look like an idiot in front of everyone. Evan, do you have any idea what my parents are dealing with right now? Evan, You could have talked to me privately. I typed one reply, then deleted it, typed another, deleted that too, because none of it would matter. People who think like that don't hear words. They hear resistance, and then they try to correct it. The next wave came from a different direction. Mutual friends, the ones who had been at the party, the ones who had watched everything happen from a safe distance, drinks in hand, quietly relieved it wasn't their relationship unraveling in real time. The first call came from Lena, his best friend's girlfriend. "Natalie, hey," she said, her voice soft in that careful way people use when they think they're being neutral. "I just wanted to check in, see how you're doing." "I'm fine," I said. There was a pause. Then, "Last night was a lot." "That's one way to put it." Another pause. Longer this time. "I think," she said slowly, "the way you left, it might have been a little intense." There it was. The reframing. The quiet shift of focus. Not what was said. Not why it mattered. But how I reacted to it. "He made a unilateral decision about our future children," I said, in front of my mother, without ever talking to me about it first. I know," she said quickly, "and you have every right to feel upset. I'm just saying, public humiliation can be really traumatic." I closed my eyes, because for a second, I genuinely wondered if I had stepped into a conversation where language meant something different. "He humiliated himself," I said evenly. I left. Silence. Then, softer. "Well, he has a right to his choices too, and I have a right to mine." I didn't wait for her response. "Take care, Lena." I hung up. By the second day, the story had started to mutate. That's how it works. It doesn't stay still long enough for truth to catch up. It shifts, spreads, adapts itself to whatever version people find easiest to believe. A message came in from someone I hadn't spoken to in months. "Hey, I heard things ended. Are you okay?" I hesitated. Then asked, "What did you hear?" 3 dots appeared. Paused. Then, "That you got upset at the party and walked out because you felt uncomfortable with his family." Uncomfortable. That word felt small, sanitized, safe. "That's not what happened," I typed. The response came quickly. "I didn't think so. It didn't sound like you." I stared at the screen for a long time after that, because it meant something important. The narrative wasn't just shifting. It was being guided. On the 3rd day, it turned ugly. "Evan, you're going to regret this." "Evan, no one walks away from me like that." "Evan, you think you can just disappear and make me the bad guy?" I read the messages once, then again. Then I took screenshots. Every single one. Saved them. Timestamped. Organized. Not because I planned to use them, but because something in my chest had shifted from shock into clarity. This wasn't about fixing anything anymore. This was about control. And people who lose control rarely do it quietly. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, the glow of the screen reflecting faintly in the dark window. I hadn't responded to anyone. Not Evan, not his family, not the friends trying to soften the edges of what happened. But the silence was starting to feel dangerous. Not for me, for the story. Because if you don't tell your version of events, someone else will. And they won't tell it kindly. I opened a blank document, stared at the empty space for a long time. Then I closed it again. Not yet. Because I needed to understand something first. I needed to know whether what happened that night had been impulsive or intentional. And I had a feeling, a quiet, persistent one, that the answer to that question was going to change everything. 8 days after the party, things escalated in a way I hadn't fully prepared for. Up until that point, everything had been predictable. Messages, calls, narratives shifting behind the scenes. But there's a difference between pressure from a distance and someone stepping directly into your space. I was at work when it happened. I'm a mechanical engineer at a consulting firm. Nothing glamorous. Fluorescent lighting, deadlines, a steady rhythm of problem solving that usually keeps my mind too occupied to spiral. That morning had been almost normal. Almost, until my receptionist called my extension. "Natalie, there's someone here asking to see you. Says it's a family matter." My stomach dropped, because I already knew. "Who is it?" I asked, even though I didn't need to. "Mr. Whitmore." Of course it was. I closed my eyes for a second, then stood up. "I'll come down." He was standing in the lobby when I got there, perfectly dressed, perfectly composed, like he had stepped out of a boardroom instead of into a place he had no right to be. Evan's father, Richard Whitmore. For a brief moment, I allowed myself a small, foolish thought. Maybe he's here to apologize. Maybe someone in that family has enough awareness to understand what happened. That thought lasted exactly 3 seconds. He didn't greet me, didn't ask how I was, didn't even pretend this was anything other than what it was. He handed me an envelope, thick, sealed. "This is for you," he said. I took it, opened it, Inside was a printed invoice. The engagement party. Venue. Catering. Staff. Bar. Total $8,000. I stared at the number. Then I laughed. I didn't mean to. It just happened. A short, disbelieving sound that echoed a little too loudly in the polished quiet of the lobby. "I'm sorry," I said, still holding the paper. "Is this a joke?" "You ruined the event," he said calmly. "You'll be covering the cost." I looked up at him. Really looked this time. And suddenly he made sense. Not as a person I respected, but as a piece of a system I finally understood. "I didn't ruin anything," I said. "Your son made an announcement I didn't agree with. I made a decision based on that. That doesn't make me financially responsible for a party you chose to throw." His expression tightened. "You embarrassed our family." I said 12 words, I replied. Then I left. And caused a scene. "If there was a scene after I left," I said, folding the invoice carefully and placing it back into the envelope, "it wasn't mine." His jaw shifted. A flicker of something, anger maybe, breaking through the polished surface. He stepped closer. "You're going to pay this," he said quietly, "one way or another." I didn't move, didn't step back, didn't raise my voice. "Are you threatening me?" I asked, "in my workplace lobby?" I glanced briefly toward the front desk. The receptionist was watching. So were two people waiting near the elevators. "There are cameras," I added, "and witnesses." That did it. Color rose in his face. Not shame, just irritation at being checked. He shoved the envelope into my hands again. "You'll be hearing from our attorney." I held it there for a second, then set it gently on the nearby table between us. "No," I said, "I won't." And I turned, walked back toward the elevators without looking behind me. Because some people only understand power when you refuse to participate in the version they're trying to force you into. 3 days later, it got worse. Much worse. I came home that evening to find a small gathering in my apartment parking lot. 4 people, standing in a line like they were waiting for something. Or someone. Me, Evan, his mother, his aunt, and his grandmother. 4 generations of entitlement arranged neatly under the fading light. For a second, I just sat in my car with the engine off, watching them. Not afraid. Just tired, because it felt theatrical. Like they believed this was a scene where they delivered a speech and I had a scripted response waiting to be unlocked. I stepped out of the car, closed the door, walked toward them. No one spoke at first. Then his grandmother stepped forward. She had always been the one I liked. Soft-spoken, polite, the kind of woman who asked about my mother and actually listened to the answer. "Young lady," she said gently, "we've come to talk some sense into you." There it was again. Not a conversation. A correction. "This family," she continued, "has given you an opportunity most people would only dream of. My grandson is a good man. He comes from a strong background. You're throwing that away over something trivial." Trivial. I almost smiled, because I realized standing there that none of them, not one, actually understood what had happened. Or worse, they understood perfectly and simply didn't think it mattered. "I loved your grandson," I said. Past tense. Deliberate. "But I'm not going to marry someone who publicly decides what our children will be called without ever speaking to me first." His mother stepped in immediately. "Oh, please," she snapped. "This is about your ego. You can't stand that he comes from a better family than you." "Better." I let the word hang in the air for a second. "Better how?" I asked. She laughed. A sharp, dismissive sound. "Let's not pretend we're equals here, Natalie." There it was. No more subtlety. No more polished phrasing. Just truth. Ugly and unfiltered. "My father built everything he had with his hands," I said quietly. "Your family inherited what someone else built." Her expression hardened. His aunt shifted uncomfortably. Evan said nothing. Of course he didn't. He never did when it mattered. The grandmother's tone changed then. Not soft anymore. Colder. "If you don't fix this," she said, "we'll make sure people know exactly what kind of person you are." I met her eyes. "Do whatever you need to do," I said. "I'm not changing my mind." Evan finally spoke, his voice tight. "You're making a mistake." I looked at him. Really looked. And for the first time since the party, I didn't feel anything sharp. No anger, no hurt. Just clarity. "No," I said. "I already made one. I'm correcting it." They left after that. Not dramatically. Just a quiet withdrawal, like a performance that hadn't landed the way they expected. As his mother walked past me, she muttered something under her breath. "Trash." I didn't respond. Because words like that only have power if you still need approval from the person saying them. And I didn't. That night, my phone buzzed with an email. Unknown sender. I almost ignored it. Almost. But something, instinct maybe, made me open it. The subject line was simple. "You deserve to know." I frowned. Clicked. The message was short. Direct. "Natalie, I don't know if you'll read this, but I couldn't stay quiet. I'm Evan's cousin. We've met a few times. I'm usually the one who leaves early. That speech he gave at the party, it wasn't spontaneous. He rehearsed it for days, with his mom and grandmother. They helped him write it. The goal was to establish expectations early, to make sure you understood your place in the family. Their words, not mine. I'm sorry, you didn't deserve that. Claire, I read it once, then again, then a third time. Each sentence settling deeper than the last. Rehearsed, planned, designed. My hands went cold, because suddenly the worst part of everything that had happened wasn't what he said. It was how long he had known he was going to say it, how many times he had practiced it, how many conversations had taken place behind my back while I was still believing we were building something together. I sat back slowly. The room felt different, quieter, sharper, like something invisible had finally come into focus. It hadn't been a misunderstanding. It hadn't been a bad moment. It had been a strategy. And I had been the only one in that relationship who didn't know we were playing a game. I forwarded the email to myself, saved it, then stared at the screen for a long time. Because now, I wasn't just dealing with a breakup. I was dealing with a story, one they had already started telling, one I was about to take back. For a long time, I just sat there with the email open. The glow of the screen felt too bright in the dark apartment, like it was exposing something I hadn't fully processed yet. Rehearsed. That word kept circling back. Not said in the moment, not blurted out under pressure. Practiced. Refined. Approved. I thought about the way Evan had stood there, calm, confident, smiling, and for the first time, I understood it completely. He hadn't been brave. He had been prepared. And somehow, that hurt more. The next morning, I opened my laptop again. Same blank document. Same cursor blinking patiently like it had all the time in the world. This time, I didn't close it. I started typing. Not paragraphs. Not a speech. Just the truth. Simple. Direct. Stripped of anything that could be twisted. I didn't name call. Didn't exaggerate. Didn't add emotion where facts would do more damage. When I finished, it looked like this. You may have heard that I ended my engagement abruptly or caused a scene at the party. Here's what actually happened. Evan announced, without prior discussion, that our future children would carry only his family name. My father and sister are both deceased. My family name carries deep personal meaning, and he knew that. I chose not to marry someone who would make that decision unilaterally and publicly. I wish him well, but I will not be portrayed as unreasonable for having boundaries. I read it 3 times. Then I sent it. Not to everyone. Just to the people who mattered. The ones who had reached out. The ones who had been at the party. The ones who had already heard a version of the story that didn't belong to me. Then I closed the laptop and waited. The responses came slower than I expected, which somehow made them feel more honest. Some people didn't reply at all. I wasn't surprised. Silence is easier than choosing sides. But others told me more than I had asked for. One message stood out. A woman Evan worked with. We had only met twice. She wrote, "I'm glad you said something. I didn't want to get involved, but this doesn't surprise me." He talks about relationships like they're something to manage. Like the other person just needs to be handled the right way. I read that line twice. Managed. Handled. It clicked into place with everything else. The rehearsed speech, the timing, the confidence. I hadn't been his partner. I had been his project. A few days passed. Then something shifted. The noise stopped. No more messages from Evan. No more calls from his mother. No more concerned friends trying to gently correct my reaction. It didn't fade gradually. It just ended. Like someone had finally realized the story wasn't bending the way they expected. I had a feeling why. Claire's email. I hadn't blasted it publicly, but I had shared it with a few people who had asked me, privately, what really happened. People talk. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But enough. And once the word plan starts attaching itself to a story, it's a lot harder to spin it into something sympathetic. Then came the call I didn't expect. Evan's father. I almost didn't answer. Almost. But curiosity got the better of me. Hello? There was a pause on the other end. Then, Natalie. His voice sounded different. Not softer. Just less certain. I wanted to let you know, he said. We won't be pursuing any legal action. I leaned back against the couch. Okay. Another pause. Then, and I'm sorry for coming to your workplace like that. The words felt unfamiliar coming from him, like he wasn't used to saying them. I waited, because I knew there was more. There's something you should understand, he continued. My wife has very strong opinions about how things should be done, about who our children marry, what that looks like. I didn't interrupt. I've spent a long time not pushing back on that. There it was. Not an excuse. Not quite an explanation. Something in between. Why? I asked. The question came out before I could stop it. A long silence followed. Then, because it's easier. I closed my eyes. Because I believed him. and that somehow made it worse. "What happened at that party?" he said. "I knew it wasn't right. I should have said something." "But you didn't." "No." Another pause. "I'm sorry." This time it sounded more like something real, not polished, not strategic. "Just late." I exhaled slowly. "That's a difficult way to live," I said. He gave a quiet, almost humorless laugh. "Yes," he said, "it is." Then the line went dead. I sat there for a long time after that call, not angry, not satisfied, just aware. Because for the first time, I could see the whole structure clearly. A family built on control, maintained by silence, protected by people who found it easier not to fight. Evan hadn't become that way overnight. He had learned it, practiced it, perfected it, and then tried to use it on me. A week later, my mother came over for dinner. We didn't talk about Evan much. We didn't need to. Instead, she told me stories about my father, ones I hadn't heard before. How nervous he was when he proposed, how he practiced what he was going to say and still forgot half of it, how he cried when my sister was born, how he stood outside my room the night before I left for college because he couldn't quite bring himself to say goodbye properly. He would have hated that family, she said at one point, shaking her head slightly. I smiled. "Yeah," I said, "he would have." She looked at me then, really looked. "But he would have been proud of you." That hit harder than anything else had. Not the party, not the messages, not the confrontation in the parking lot. That? Because it reframed everything. I hadn't lost something. I had protected it. People still ask me, sometimes, if I regret it. Walking out like that. Making a decision in a moment that couldn't be undone. No long conversation, no second chances, no slow unraveling. Just done. And every time my answer is the same. No. Because for 3 years I had been adjusting, explaining, excusing, smoothing over things that didn't sit right because I believed in who I thought he was. Walking out wasn't impulsive. It was the first honest decision I made in that relationship. The first time I chose myself without asking for permission. My apartment is quieter now. My life is simpler. There's no one trying to shape me into something more convenient. No one deciding what parts of my history matter and what parts don't. And maybe, one day, I'll meet someone who understands that love isn't about control. It isn't about management. It isn't about rehearsed speeches and strategic declarations. It's about respect, the kind you show in private, the kind you protect in public. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's this. Pay attention when someone shows you who they are, and pay even closer attention when their family does. It will save you years of your life.